Welcome to the deep dive. We take your sources, unpack them, and really try to get to the heart of complex topics. Today, we're looking at Malaysia and its fascinating relationship with petrol prices. The big question on the table, should those lower octane fuels, RN91 or maybe the ethanol blend E10, make a comeback? So, our mission here is to really dig into the sources you sent, explore this whole issue. We'll look at the history, what's happening right now with the R95 subsidy changes, and the arguments for and against bringing back cheaper fuel. It's surprisingly complex. All right, so just to set the scene, Malaysia, as of mid 2025, is in the middle of this big shift with its R95 subsidy. The idea is to trim the national budget fat, basically, but they also want to keep fuel affordable. For ages, the government kind of shielded people from volatile world oil prices. The catch, it cost a fortune. Billions and billions poured into subsidies, and that's put a real strain on the country's finances.
Yeah, and it creates this paradox, doesn't it? You've got RN95 subsidized down at RM2.05 a liter, but then RN97 is way up at RN3.21. This is July 2025 pricing. So there's this big gap, this fuel cliff, some call it. And despite RN95 being relatively cheap, there's still this strong public feeling, especially from the B40 group, the bottom 40% income earners,
Right.
that they need something even cheaper. They spend, what, about 7.2% of their income on fuel? That's roughly RM243 a month.
Yeah.
So the core question we're digging into is, would a cheaper option genuinely help people deal with subsidy cuts? Or could it, backfire somehow? Some sources even worry about unforeseen negative consequences.
Okay, let's rewind a bit then. Talk about the history. For decades, RN91 or sometimes RN92, you could find it at pumps across Malaysia. But then in 2009, RN92 was officially phased out. RN95 became the standard. Why?
Well, it was mostly about keeping up with cars. Engine technology was changing. Newer cars generally perform better and had cleaner emissions with RN95, so it was sort of a modernization step. Got it. So bringing back RN91 or even E10, this ethanol blend, it kind of feels like going backwards, doesn't it? But people are talking about it. You hear it in coffee shops, see it online. Why the nostalgia?
It's simple, really. It's the promise of saving money. That's the siren song, right?
Yeah.
A cheaper option at the pump. But it's crucial to see this isn't just flipping a switch. Some sources argue it's a bit like, I don't know, asking people to ditch their smartphones for old rotary phones just because the calls might be cheaper.
Okay, fair point. So what are the big roadblocks then?
Well, first off, infrastructure. Your sources really hammer this point home. It would be a massive job. Think about it. Setting up completely separate supply chains, new storage tanks, different pumps at the stations.
Wow, okay.
It's a huge logistical challenge. We're talking serious capital investment and the bureaucratic headache. Probably enormous. Hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of ringgit.
Okay, that sounds like a major, major hurdle. But hang on, what about E10, the
Yeah.
ethanol blend? That sounds greener, maybe cheaper. I mean, you look at Australia, right? They sell E10, and it's often 10, maybe 20 cents cheaper than their regular unleaded.
That's true. But exactly. It could be a wash or even cost more overall for some drivers, depending on how much less efficient it makes their car.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. And then there are the wider economic factors, right? We mentioned the subsidy rationalization. The whole point is to save government money.
Precisely. The government wants to cut down that huge subsidy bill. We mentioned RM29 billion potentially cut in 2025. It's a colossal amount.
So how does bringing in another fuel fit with that?
Well, that's the tricky part. If RN95 stays subsidized for most people, but RN91 or E10 are cheaper but unsubsidized, why would the average person switch?
Good point.
And this raises the specter of smuggling. We've seen it happen with diesel, right? When you have big price differences between subsidized and unsubsidized fuel or across borders,
Yeah, it becomes a target.
it becomes an absolute magnet for illegal activity. Fuel stations near borders could become hotspots, adding another fuel grade, another price point. It just makes that whole game of whack-a-mole even harder for the authorities. No finance minister wants that headache.
And environmental concerns? Didn't Malaysia phase out the older fuel partly for environmental reasons?
That's right. RN92, back in 2009, had higher sulfur content, which isn't great for air quality. Now, theoretically, you could make RN91 meet modern standards like Euro 4M or even Euro 5, cleaner emissions.
Nah.
But the cost of refining it to meet those standards might just wipe out the potential savings. It might not end up being that much cheaper to produce than R95 once you factor that in.
And E10.
Yeah.
Using palm oil sounds local, but
But it opens up the whole deforestation debate.
yeah.
Using large amounts of palm oil for fuel has environmental implications that need serious thought.
Okay. One last roadblock you mentioned was perception.
Yeah, public perception. R95 has kind of become the standard, maybe even seen as slightly premium compared to what came before. If you bring back R91, there's a risk it gets labeled as the budget fuel, the cheap option, maybe even sneered at a bit. That stigma could really hurt adoption, even if it's technically fine for many cars.
Wow, okay. So, quite a list of potential problems. Infrastructure, compatibility, cost, smuggling, environment, perception. But despite all that, the sources also make a case for bringing these fuels back. So what's the argument on the other side? How do they see this as a pragmatic plan?
Well, the biggest driver is absolutely economic relief, particularly for that B40 group we talked about.
Potential savings.
Exactly. Even a small saving per liter can add up significantly for lower-income households spending a noticeable chunk of their budget on fuel. And they point to regional neighbors. It's not like Malaysia would be alone. Australia has E10, Thailand has gas-oil E10, even E20. Indonesia has R90 and RN92, priced 10–15% cheaper than Malaysia's RN95.
So there are working models out there.
There are precedents, yeah. These countries manage multiple fuel grades and offer cheaper alternatives. And then there's this really fascinating point, the performance paradox. For a lot of the vehicles actually on Malaysian roads, think older cars, many motorcycles, they have lower compression engines. And research actually shows that for those specific engines, RR91 isn't just cheaper, it might actually be better.
Better? How?
Studies suggest these engines can get slightly more power, like 4 to 5% more, using RN91 compared to RN95.
Seriously?
Yeah, and better fuel efficiency too, about 5.6% lower brake-specific fuel consumption, meaning they use less fuel for the power they produce, and lower emissions of things like carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons.
So for some people, the cheaper fuel could actually make their vehicle run better.
Potentially, yes. It's counterintuitive, like finding out the budget airline seat is actually more comfortable for you.
Yeah.
For engines not designed for high octane, using it doesn't help. It might even slightly hinder performance or efficiency.
Okay, that flips the script a bit. What about the environmental angle from this side? You mentioned deforestation concerns with E10 earlier.
Right, but proponents of E10 highlight its potential benefits too. Ethanol blends can cut greenhouse gas emissions by up to 5% compared to standard petrol. And there's research, like from CSIRO in Australia, showing E10 has maybe 2–5% lower CO2 emissions overall. And the key argument here is using local resources.
Yeah.
If the ethanol comes from Malaysia's own palm oil industry done sustainably, that's the important caveat. It creates a kind of circular economy.
Reducing import dependency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Less reliance on imported oil, supporting local industry. That's a strong pull.
Okay, but let's circle back to those massive infrastructure costs you mentioned earlier. That seemed like a deal breaker. How does the pro side address that?
Well, they argue the idea that every single petrol station needs all fuel types right away is perhaps flawed.
Like you don't expect every restaurant to serve every type of food.
Precisely. They suggest a more strategic rollout. Start with high-traffic areas, major cities, highways. Focus on places with lots of motorcycles, which could really benefit from RN91. And remember, many, if not most, modern cars can already handle E10 perfectly fine. So the compatibility issue, while real for older cars, might not be as universal as it first sounds for E10 specifically.
Okay, a phased approach. Makes sense.
And then there's a behavioral economics argument, which is quite interesting.
Go on.
The current system, basically just R95 and the much pricier R97, it kind of creates this octane elitism or maybe forced premiumization. People might be buying R95 not because their basic cancel or motorcycle needs it, but because the only other option is way more expensive, or there is no cheaper option.
So they default to 95.
Right. Introducing RN91 or E10 as a clear value option changes the whole dynamic. It reframes RN95 as the mid-grade fuel. This actually empowers consumers, allows them to make a choice based on what their vehicle really needs and what their budget allows, rather than being pushed towards a higher grade by default.
Right, giving people genuine choice based on need, not just price tiers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
More informed decisions.
Okay, so we've got these two really strong, almost contradictory sets of arguments. One saying, don't do it, it's complicated, costly, risky. The other saying, but think of the savings, the efficiency for some, the local benefits. How do we even begin to weigh these?
Well, what's clear is that both sides see the complexities. Nobody thinks it's simple.
Yeah.
Even those advocating for reintroduction acknowledge the challenges. Take smuggling, for example. Some sources, like the Academy Sains Malaysia, suggest ways to manage it, perhaps using technology like RFID tags on vehicles or targeted coupons for subsidies, so only eligible people get the benefit.
So managing the risks rather than avoiding the idea altogether.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
But the big hurdle might still be perception, convincing people that cheaper fuel isn't automatically worse fuel. Like convincing someone used to fancy coffee that a simple local brew can be just as good, maybe even better for them.
That's a tough sell sometimes.
It can be. And some sources even sketch out a possible roadmap. Don't just flip the switch overnight. Maybe start small. A pilot program. Introduce RON91 at, say, 20 selected stations for 6 months. See what happens.
Test the water.
Exactly. Then maybe a wider 12-month expansion, bringing in E10, perhaps linking it to local ethanol production starting up. Then maybe full market rollout after 18 months or more, once the kinks are worked out.
A gradual, evidence-based approach.
So something like that. It suggests a way to navigate the risks and gather real-world data.
Okay, so this deep dive really shows Malaysia's at a fascinating point with its fuel policy. It's genuinely a crossroads. The push for a cheaper option, especially thinking about the B40 group and cost of living pressures, it makes a lot of sense. The arguments supporting it are strong.
They are. But as we've unpacked, the path is absolutely littered with challenges. You've got the legacy issues, the engine compatibility minefield, that ever-present worry about subsidies leaking out through smuggling, and just the sheer administrative complexity of managing another fuel grade nationwide.
Yeah.
It really is that classic dilemma. Is the potential cure actually worse than the disease? That needs very careful thought.
Yeah, it boils down to this fundamental trade-off, doesn't it? Is the potential gain in consumer choice and maybe some economic efficiency worth tackling all those logistical, maybe environmental, and definitely administrative headaches?
Absolutely. And underlying it all, as your sources really emphasize, fuel isn't just about chemistry or economics.
It's politics.
It's deeply political, yes, and social.
So turning this back to you, the listener, as Malaysia navigates this shift towards fiscal sustainability, trying to rationalize those R95 subsidies, here's something to think about. If they did offer a cheaper option, say RN91 or E10 appeared at the pumps, what would you do? Would you prioritize the potential savings, maybe knowing it's actually better for your older car or motorbike? Or would you stick with the familiar RN95, maybe valuing the perceived simplicity or performance? What factors would really shape your decision when you pull up to fill the tank? Lots to consider there. Thanks for diving deep with us today.